Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about being buried alive. And Chris, it's a fear that throughout history, a lot of people have had.
Yes. And you know, Ray, it's this story that we're going to talk about today is not just one about being buried alive, but it also has ghosts and just all kinds of Halloween-ish kind of activities. And I guess this is our spooktacular episode. And I'm really excited to talk about it, even though I really don't like the topic of being buried alive or ghosts or anything. But, you know, this story actually comes to us from about 1810 and taking place not too far from us down in Wilmington, North Carolina. And what's interesting is you can go to the cemetery today right there in Wilmington, and you might not find the tombstone with his name on it, but what you will find is a really cool story.
Yeah, and the guy's name that we're going to talk about today is a guy called Samuel Jocelyn. And his friend, best friend, I guess you could say, Alexander Hostler, who were living in Wilmington, like you said, in 1809, 1810, when this particular story takes place. And if our listeners are interested in visiting the cemetery where this all allegedly went down, it's the St. James Episcopal Church there on Market Street in Wilmington. Now, I've been there multiple times, and like Chris said, there's no marker there with Samuel Jocelyn's name on it, at least not that you can see. The cemetery is fenced in. So it's not something you can actually go to and say, oh, well, there's his grave. His grave is in there, but exactly where it is, I don't know. And this story really, even though the events we're going to talk about today happened in 1810, something that is important to the story actually occurred in 1809 when Alexander and Jocelyn's going to be the one we're going to be focusing on today, but when Alexander and Jocelyn made a pact with each other. And the pact was basically the result of a discussion they were having on life after death and ghosts and all that kind of thing. And basically they agreed with each other, if one of them was to die, the other one would come back to them, I guess in ghost form, and give them a message. So that's going to become very important here as we go through the events that are going to unfold in 1810 concerning mainly Jocelyn, but secondarily Alexander.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting for people to know this isn't just a conversation that just all of a sudden came up where people are like, hey, let's just talk about, you know, what happens if we die. But as you mentioned, this was a deep subject, and both Samuel and Alexander, who also kind of had the name Sandy, you know, both of these guys were very from affluent families, and they were very well educated, and they would come together and they would discuss philosophical ideas. And so this is not just a fun kind of conversation, but they're really struggling like with the afterlife and all of these things. And so I think they kind of put that pact, as you said, you know, into this. And it's interesting that I don't know, Ray, if this was something that was always on the forefront of their minds, but it was just like we had the conversation, very good discussion, and then move on and go do your life. And that kind of takes us to July 4th, 1809.
Yeah, and you know, you wonder if it's something they even thought any more about. You know, was this just sort of a one-off? We're going to make this pact and then forget about it. And then about a year later, you know, oh my gosh, it actually comes to pass, allegedly.
Yeah, and so going back to that date that I mentioned, you know, July 4th, 1809, what happens on that date is that Samuel, he decides to get married, and he marries Mary Ann Sampson, who is from another wealthy Wilmington family. And, you know, he's going to settle down and he's going to open up his law practice, and he's just going to establish his life, and things are going to be good. And unfortunately, you know, his marriage seems to be a short one. And Ray, this is where the story kind of shifts a little bit, if we will. I found it interesting in looking at the different newspaper clippings and the writings. that as with many stories in history, some detail a lot of events and some leave out some events. And so then you kind of got to put everything together and figure out how it works. But I found this to be interesting that the events start on March 16th, 1810. So, Samuel's been married for less than a year, and the Jocelyns, and there's several other wealthy families that are vacationing at a hunting lodge. And as the story goes, Mary Ann and Samuel got into a fight that evening. And I don't know what the fight was about, don't know what was going on, but it was to the point where Samuel was like, I've had it, I'm done, I'm ready to go, I'm out of here. And so in a rage, he just flees out of the hunting lodge, has a thin coat on, and due to poor weather, due to the conditions, something happens to him.
Yeah, and we're not exactly sure what happened. I know that, like you said, he fled apparently in something of a huff on a horse. And I believe the horse was found, but it was like 2 days later, they find Samuel's body laying, I guess, in a creek or in the mud somewhere. And they take him out, and they go out and they hold a funeral for him in Wilmington, there at the St. James Episcopal Church there in Wilmington. And I guess, time goes by, maybe, I think it was the night of Samuel's funeral. Alexander is laying in bed, probably still disturbed by what had happened. And all of a sudden, the ghost of his friend Jocelyn appears to him and basically says, why did you let them bury me when I am not dead? And Alexander's like, you were dead. And apparently this happened maybe on that night, and I think, Chris, the next night as well. And finally, Jocelyn, the ghost of Jocelyn, looks at Alexander and says, go to the cemetery and dig me up. Now, this is where I think, Chris, the story would end for me, because I'd be like, I am not going to the cemetery and digging you up. But Alexander got a group of people together, and I believe at least one prominent citizen in Wilmington as well. And they went out to the cemetery with torches and shovels to dig up the body of Samuel Jocelyn.
Yeah, no, you would have gone a lot further than I would, because just the fact of, first of all, him showing up in my room as a ghost, that's about all that I need. That's about done. And I don't know what I could do and how I could do it. I mean, I would be at a loss. And, once again, it's interesting that this happens not once, but possibly even 2 more times. And Sandy, or Alexander's shaken by the vision, he's thinking, look, I'm not sleeping, I'm grieving. But he goes and seeks the advice of another guy. And basically it's that guy that says, dude, do you remember that you guys made a pact?
Yeah.
And so, Samuel, Sandy had kind of forgotten all about that. And so then his friend kind of says, do you think that somehow that Samuel has hidden something in the coffin that is like some proof that he's alive after death, and you need to go and open that coffin? And, I'm like, no, that's not me. I'm not doing that, or what. But they decide that it would do, and they're going to go and exhume the body. And I mean, I don't like going to a cemetery during the day, much less at night, especially with the task that I'm going to open up a coffin that's been in the ground. And I don't know. And if I could do that now, and you're the guy. So, I mean, you're the scary guy. I'm
the morbid one.
Yeah. So
just to clarify, Sandy and Alexander are the same person, by the way.
Right. Sorry.
And Sandy are the same person. And it was a friend of, like you said, of Alexander and Samuel Jocelyn, who actually suggested ultimately that they go ultimately dig up the body. It was a guy named Louis Toomer, Toomer. He was the one who actually suggested, well, let's go see what happened. As morbid as I am, Chris, I would not have gone out there and dug up the body. But cemeteries don't bother me. I mean, they probably should, because when I was a child, and I don't remember what adult told me this, but when we'd go to cemeteries, they would tell me, don't step on the graves because the person will come out and drag you under with them. So for the longest time, even into adulthood, when I'd go to a cemetery, I'd walk between the graves, even if it was not the straightest path to where I was going. So I would never have been a very good cemetery, lawn keeper. I would have been terrible at that job.
So what happens when they actually do this? I mean, they get up enough nerve and they actually go and they're going to exhume the body. And what do they see?
Well, it's interesting because, like you said, Lewis had suggested that maybe he left some sign behind or something. But what ultimately they see when they dig up the grave is they open the casket. Samuel Jocelyn is laying on his stomach, and the inside of the casket supposedly looks like he's been beating and scratching the inside of the casket trying to get out, which of course he wouldn't have been able to due to the weight of the dirt and the soil on top of the casket. But if that was true, if that indeed did happen, then it shows that yes, they did bury Samuel Jocelyn alive. And more interestingly, Chris, and I think probably for you more disturbingly, Samuel Jocelyn went and told Alexander or Sandy that he was buried alive, which of course means there is such thing as ghosts.
Yeah, and that's the thing that gets me is that, some elements of this story, actually has him saying, listen, I'm not dead. Open the coffin and you will see that I am not lying in the same position I was when I was placed in burial. And yeah, first of all, can you imagine the guilt that he must have had when he opens the casket and sees that what this apparition, this ghost had said was actually true, and that he was not the victim of some delusion or overwrought nerves, but he had kept it quiet. Can you imagine living with that the rest of your life?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to. I mean, just going out in the middle of the night, you know me, Chris, I wouldn't be able to keep that to myself. I would tell everybody I knew, guess what I did last night? But seeing that image that would have to disturb you for the rest of your life. And then the fear it must have installed in Lewis, in Alexander, that they themselves one day could be buried alive. I mean, imagine assuming that Samuel Jocelyn, this whole story is actually true. Imagine, you're knocked off your horse or whatever, you're unconscious, and you wake up in this very small container and you realize you've been buried alive.
Yeah, and that's what they kind of, after this all happened, they decided to do more forensics, whatever forensics was in the 1800s. And, I think that the assumption is that he had fallen from the horse, and I guess he had fallen unconscious for a particular amount of time. And I forget, I think they called it, was it catalepsy or something like that, where you basically have this suspension of animation and you get muscular.
Yeah, very shallow breathing. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's like the accompanying muscular rigidity, and where it just basically looks like you're dead. And they were in such a hurry, which I haven't quite figured out, why they were in such a hurry to bury him, but they just seemed to be in such a hurry that they buried him while he was comatose, and he wasn't. And they actually saw, as you mentioned, the bloody fingers and the stubs of trying to get out, but they also noticed that he had partly loosened one side of the coffin, in this frantic struggle to free himself. But you have to be thinking, if you're in that coffin, even if you do break free from the coffin, it's dirt that's on top of you.
And several feet of dirt on top of you, 6 feet, anywhere by, I guess, 3 feet to 6 feet, anywhere in that ballpark, the amount of dirt that's on the coffin. And one thing that listeners may be asking about would be embalming and embalmment. Remember, this event happened in 1810. And embalming was a thing, obviously. Embalming goes back to the ancient Egyptians, but embalming really wasn't something that was done in the United States until the Civil War, when they had to preserve the bodies, to get them back home. So it's very unlikely that someone like Samuel Jocelyn would have been embalmed. So it's very easy to see how, like you say, he would have just simply been put in a box and buried in the ground, and he could have very easily woken up from whatever medical condition he had.
And I think as we wrap up this episode of this, it's what's interesting. This is not just a story that's told one time. It's not something that we just went back in and we found one time, but that this story was passed on by highly respected people in Wilmington who told the story and actually verified the story numerous times. And so, we can't sit here today and say, oh, what a great tale, what a wonderful little ghost story. But maybe there's more to it than that, Ray.
Well, before, if you go to St. James Episcopal Church now, of course, there's a large a large metal gate around the cemetery. You can't get into the cemetery unless you have a key to get in or someone lets you in. There's also security cameras there. But back in the days before that, what people would do, and this is just, cemeteries don't bother me now, despite what I was told as a child, but I still wouldn't do this. People would go into the cemetery, and the challenge was they would find Samuel Jocelyn's grave, and they would lay on the grave with their ear to the ground for a period of about an hour. And the legend is, how true this is, I don't know, but the legend is nobody could actually complete laying there for 1 hour without running away. I don't know what they heard or what they experienced. It sort of reminds me when I was growing up, the Bloody Mary game. Did you ever play that as a child?
No, Ray, I can't say that I did.
You know what I'm talking about?
I do know what you're talking about, and I can honestly say that I did not participate in that game. But do you want to tell the listeners about it?
Yeah, I did. And basically what it was, you would go into a bathroom or a room that had a large mirror, and you would turn off all the lights, and then you would rotate around, close your eyes and rotate around, 3 times or something like that. And every time you did, you were supposed to say Bloody Mary, something Bloody Mary. And when you open your eyes, allegedly she would be there in the mirror, and you would get scratches on your face and all of that kind of stuff. But I never got scratches on my face, and I can honestly say I never saw Bloody Mary.
Now, Ray, you this summer actually taught some ghost stories, I think, to some students at Blaine Community College. Is that right?
Yeah, we did a camp for, I guess it was middle school students, something like that. And we had a section on ghost stories. And I did tell the story of Samuel Jocelyn. So I'm probably responsible for a number of kids' nightmares over the summer.
I wonder if old Samuel Jocelyn knew that you and I were including him as part of our podcast. He'd probably roll over in his grave.
That's wrong. Whatever's left of him might roll back the right way. That's something about this that I've never been able, by the way, in all seriousness, I've had a question, and that is, what did they do with the body? Did they just cover it back up? Did they bring the body out, fix everything and put him back? I don't know.
I would think, honestly, that because this caused a lot of grief, and, there's a lot of unanswered questions we have, but I can imagine that they needed to understand what had happened, just to prevent something like this from ever happening again. And I do think, this is very helpful for science, this catalepsy, understanding that, and unfortunately, we've heard stories in which people have actually gone to the process of being declared dead and not being dead. So, so it's not a fluke thing. I think that there's a really, really good possibility that this was a terrible, terrible tragedy, that he had this episode, but that they buried him alive. Mm-hmm. And, now the ghost issue and all of that, there's all kinds of things on television these days that talk about spirits, that talk about, these weird incidents and occurrences, as you mentioned, about laying down on the grave, which is another reason why I think that it's an unmarked grave, because Samuel Jocelyn would receive a lot of attention, and it is a church cemetery. So Ray, I think that's probably why this grave is unmarked. It's to prevent those people from coming, and especially during the season of Halloween, we have to recognize this is a church, it is a cemetery. There's plenty of people that have been buried there, and as you mentioned earlier about respecting those who have departed. So I just think that there's so much to recognize as far as being helpful in this story, whether all of it is true or whether all of it is false. There's a lot of things we can learn from this lesson.
Yeah, and one thing that we do learn from it is that there is a real fear of death, not just simply a fear of being buried alive, but a fear of death. And great people throughout history, including George Washington. One thing about George Washington is, nobody really wants to die, and he, I guess you could say, died, in a very stoic type of way. His last words was, "I die hard." But even he, had them leave his body out for, I think it was 2 or 3 days before he will allow them to bury him. And you mentioned earlier that, even today, you will have oftentimes, of course, in third world countries where maybe they don't embalm, or different cultures where they don't embalm, you may have stories about someone waking up in the funeral home, or even in the United States, stories about people waking up in the morgue before they get to the funeral home. So, it's still something we have going on today. So, that just would be, completely horrifying. So Chris, I enjoyed this episode. Hope our listeners enjoyed this episode. If you would like to share this episode, please do so. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter. You could find us on Sounder FM, Spotify, Google Podcast, and all of those podcast outlets. If you'd like to contact us, you can contact us at history, the letter you should know, gmail.com. That's history you should know at gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.